Apple's MacBook Neo has taken the laptop market by storm. It's an Apple laptop that comes in at a mere $600 asking price, landing at a similar cost to commodity Windows laptops, and has reportedly sold in massive quantities. But getting to that price point has meant some deep cuts, as the device uses a phone processor and just 8GB of unified memory. So do those concessions make it a poor choice for gaming? And how does it fare in professional computing workloads?
This video is brought to you by PlayTracker, an app that connects to your various gaming platform accounts to combine and manage all your data in one easy-to-use place. PlayTracker pulls everything together: your playtime, achievements and statistics. You earn XP, level up and unlock rewards by tracking your entire cross-platform game library in a single unified profile, creating a monument to your gaming career. In addition to that, you can connect with all of your gaming friends regardless of platform, show off your genre expertise by earning guild badges, and even participate in giveaways by completing challenges. It supports linking with all major platforms like Steam, Xbox, PlayStation and Nintendo, but crucially for fans of DF Retro, it also fully supports retro achievements. To find out more, head to playtracker.net/digitalfoundry or click the link in the video description below.
Apple's MacBooks are well known for their high specs, but that doesn't apply to the Neo. This 13-inch laptop has a list of concessions that I never expected to see in a MacBook computer. That's obvious from the moment you turn the device on. There's no backlit keyboard for one, a first for any MacBook introduced since the 2010 MacBook Air. Instead, the keyboard is bright, pale, and bereft of any LEDs. Touch ID comes with the higher-end 512GB model, but the base machine just has a scissor switch power button. The trackpad has a sharp mechanical click without the forced touch trickery of Apple trackpads since 2015. It uses a different mechanism without a hinge, so it can be actuated from areas on the trackpad close to the keyboard, but it's still a cheaper mechanical design. Thunderbolt is a no-show in the Neo, foreclosing the possibility of PCIe expansion or 5K display support. Plus, only one of the system's two USB Type-C ports supports USB 3. The second port is consigned to 2.0 speeds and is best used for power input. In practice, the Neo is a hard machine to dock and it isn't very peripheral friendly. But it's not all bad. The system's display is a Retina class panel with great color reproduction, albeit limited to a 60Hz refresh and lacking the local dimming niceties of the MacBook Pro and Studio Display XDR. It seems to generally hit the same display specs as other Apple IPS LCDs produced over the past 10 years or so, minus display P3 support, so it's a cut above the typical commodity 1080p panel we often see in this segment. Plus, the system has a great fit and finish with an all-aluminum chassis, anodized beautifully with one of 4 color choices. My Indigo unit offers a cool, understated slate exterior with contrasting keyboard accents, and it looks and feels terrific. Apple hasn't cheaped out on their signature unibody laptop design. If anything, I'd say this is possibly the cutest MacBook to date. But the biggest concessions in the Neo design are internal. Instead of going with an M-series chip, Apple has elected to use the A18 Pro that we saw in 2024's iPhone 16 Pro. That means a much smaller GPU and CPU configuration than Apple's M-series. Plus, these chips are rejects from the production line, with one of 6 GPU cores disabled. And that chip is paired with a meager 8GB of unified package-on-package memory, constraining the range of demanding workloads that can run on the machine. All of Apple's new computers since late 2024 have featured 16GB of RAM or greater, but the Neo will have to make do with just half that allocation. The Neo is a fascinating computer that combines a premium fit and finish with some pretty deep concessions in connectivity and internal components, landing on a spec that isn't really going to please power users. That's not going to stop us, of course, from putting the device through the ringer in the most demanding workloads we can find, starting with AAA gaming. The first game I tested on Neo was Kojima Productions' Death Stranding, which has an excellent Mac port that typically likes low-spec hardware. I started with medium settings, turning on a couple niceties like screen space reflections, which aren't normally enabled with the medium settings configuration, and dialing memory for streaming to low. With Metal Effects in Performance mode at 1080p output, we reach a wobbly 45 to 60 FPS update in typical play. That doesn't feel great and doesn't pair nicely with the Neo's fixed refresh panel, so I elected to toggle a 30 FPS cap in-game and paired it with an increase in input res, with quality level upscaling. 30 FPS proved very achievable for the stripped back phone processor, apart from some brief stutters from time to time and some extended dips while evading enemies. There were some minor drops as well at times, which were sometimes accompanied by frame pacing wobbles. It's not a bad experience by any means, however, for this cell phone chip, with reasonable visual quality and a very playable output. Control is another game that works pretty well on recent iPhones, and the turnout on A18 Pro is pretty solid. I elected to go with a 1080p output again, paired with Metal Effects in Performance mode in the low settings preset. Again, we're in 45 to 60 FPS territory typically here, though the overall performance level is a bit higher than Death Stranding. It's surprisingly solid for a game of this visual pedigree, and memory seems to be reasonably well respected, averaging at about 4.5 to 5 GB of indicated usage across the system's unified memory. It does make me reflect a little bit though on the iPhone and iPad versions of this game, which almost certainly could have delivered 40 FPS gameplay based on this showing if such a configuration was available. Instead, the iPhone and iPad versions are stuck with a 30 FPS internal cap, demanding a pretty iffy frame-gen implementation to attempt a faster refresh. Just for fun, we can dial on the game's ray tracing on medium, which brings us into the 20 to 30 FPS frame rate range if we leave settings otherwise untouched. That's sort of playable, I suppose, but obviously far from ideal. High ray tracing, which turns on every ray traced effect barring sample count, comes in at about 20 FPS and pushes us closer to RAM oversubscription. Red Legends is up next. We're at 720p with low settings and TAA here, as there's no metal effects to speak of. Frame rates are quite variable. More sedate tracks regularly hit a full 60 FPS, while busier sections can get dragged into the 30s and 40s. It's not a great outcome, and a reminder that in rasterization terms, an A18 Pro seems substantially below the performance level of a last generation console for gaming, so we do need to take advantage of metal effects for a good result. Next up is an RE Engine heavy hitter, Resident Evil 4. I've dialed in a mix of low and medium settings alongside Metal Effects in Performance mode at 720p. Unfortunately, RE4 doesn't appear to support Metal Effects Temporal on Mac, so this is its FSR1-like spatial version, which produces blurred and low quality results. Again, 40 to 60 FPS is the typical run of play, bottoming out in intense parts of this introductory village shootout. It's not great, but the game's 30 FPS cap is horrifically broken on Mac, so a wobbly presentation is a better call if we don't want to start using external tools. Not a great outcome perhaps, but it does follow sensibly from the iPhone version, where iPhone 15 Pro had a similarly low internal resolution and a 30 FPS cap. Finally, we've got arguably the biggest Mac game out at the moment, Cyberpunk 2077. Unfortunately, this game might be just too big for MacBook Neo, because even with low settings and aggressive metal effects at 720p, we're not remotely close to a consistent frame rate. We may be limited somewhat by the Neo's narrow CPU, or suffering from other problems, but in any case, this is not playable in my opinion. These frame time spikes render the game difficult to enjoy in this state, plus expect some conspicuous visual issues with shadows to round out the experience. At least the game isn't crashing, I suppose. If we push beyond these last and cross-gen efforts towards current-gen fare, we run into harder limits. Assassin's Creed Shadows will boot on the Neo, but runs out of memory before it enters the main menu and needs to be quit. Shadow's minimum specs exceed the Neo by some margin, so this doesn't come as a surprise. Advanced current-gen fare seems out of the question for Apple's cut-price laptop. The Neo is well positioned to enjoy simpler games, however, and like other Macs, it can run iPad apps. 2016's Riptide GP Renegade is a perfectly smooth experience on Neo, as you might expect, and the relatively basic Rush Rally Origins is also a safe bet, at least with settings pared back somewhat. Simpler 3D efforts seem to be in the Neo's wheelhouse, games that run comfortably on iPhones and iPads. That's because for gaming purposes, our MacBook Neo basically is an iPhone. The Neo packs the same processor as an iPhone 16 Pro, so it falls between a 15 Pro and a 17 Pro in graphics benchmarks. A19 Pro represented a relatively large performance upgrade, and the Neo falls behind somewhat, especially in heavy ray tracing workloads. Compared to higher-end iPads, the M2 iPad Air and M5 iPad Pro, we're falling behind as well. Even relatively old M-series hardware gets the better of our die-harvested phone chip, except in some ray tracing workloads, as the M2 lacks hardware RT support. The M5 is good for about triple the performance of A18 Pro in graphics rendering, which suggests even low-end Mac chips will prove a much better choice for enthusiast users. Neo does sustain performance better than our iPads and iPhones though, with a low measured performance loss over the course of a Steel Nomad Lite stress test. Our Neo is good for about 90% of peak performance at worst, iPhones and M2 iPad give us about 70%, and the throttling prone M5 iPad pulls up the rear with 58%. Neo benefits from packing a lot of thermal mass relative to TDP, so even though it's still a fanless device, it can sustain iPhone beating wattages under load. It's also likely that the chip can sustain higher temperatures without causing discomfort for the user. On the other hand, the M5 iPad Pro has a very thin chassis and a much more power-hungry chip, so it exhibits peakier performance. The MacBook Neo is a decent little computer in everyday use. Light tasks, think web browsing, listening to music, looking at photos, word processing, or any other relatively common computer task, will work just fine in the Neo. Multitasking works, but within limits. I was able to open up a fair number of browser tabs along with a music player and a few other apps, and the system worked well enough, but I oversubscribed a bit on memory and started eating into decent chunks of swap. Pulling up Final Cut Pro, I was able to navigate a few projects without issue, and playback worked well enough, especially with optimized media. It pushed harder into swap, deputizing about 6GB of storage as memory, but the computer was still reasonably responsive. Chrome tabs took a moment to materialize after being clicked, but that wasn't too much of an annoyance. macOS uses a variety of strategies to manage memory, including compressing infrequently accessed data, caching frequently accessed data, and using SSD storage as swap for additional virtual memory. Plus, Apple Silicon Macs use a proper unified memory model, which is more console-like than PC-like, though some legacy software and PC ports can still express split memory hangups. 8GB goes further here than you'd expect, especially in lighter multitasking, where swap use is less obvious. I wouldn't exactly trade the 128GB of memory on my personal Mac for 8GB, but it's a surprisingly usable computer. I did try to run some more intense workloads on the computer as well. Final Cut export times are perfectly fine in my opinion. M4 is obviously much faster, but for casual videos and shorter form content, I think a Neo could be perfectly fine. Playback and navigation on the device was mostly fine as well, absent a few more complex compositions where the frame rate did drop. Final Cut is a relatively friendly video editor for lower end computers though, so it makes sense that it would work pretty well on Neo. Handbrake demonstrates stronger scaling. An M4 Mac Mini completes this 4K 60 video encode in about a third the time of the fanless core star of Neo, while the top-end M4 Max chip comes in at about 1/6 the Neo's time. These chips all technically belong to the same revision of CPU and GPU architectures, but larger actively cooled configurations fare much better in Handbrake, which shows fairly linear scaling at these core counts. I don't think the Neo is a great production machine for a variety of reasons, but it's at least usable in a pinch for professional work, and it's probably good enough for most casual fare. The MacBook Neo is an excellent all-around computer. It has brilliant build quality, a beautiful design, pleasing control surfaces, and a good display. Like other Apple Silicon Macs, it's very responsive in moment-to-moment use with few hangs, stutters, or other performance annoyances. It's a pleasure to use for the most part and comes recommended at least to less demanding and price-conscious users. That's because the Neo constrains somewhat as you push out the multitasking load, and 8GB of RAM could prove an issue especially as macOS develops and adds more local AI features. Connectivity is also a concern. No Thunderbolt and only one USB 3 puts a hard stop on more expansive docked workflows. In gaming, the Neo can put up a fight against last-gen and cross-gen titles, but the Neo is best employed selectively, as its 8GB of RAM poses hard limits for current-gen titles, and its cell phone-class CPU and GPU, being 8th-gen games, require significant compromises. On the flip side, anything with a more mobile-friendly flavor will rip on the Neo, like more primitive iPad games. Apple's MacBook Neo is a surprisingly competent computer that delivers an excellent user experience. It can't outrun its meager on-paper specs, but it proves quite versatile. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content and to get in touch, use social media.